Started. So tonight we are going to be talking about strength and mobility needs for injury prevention in triathlon. My name is Jennie Hansen. I'm a QT2 Systems coach. I'm also a physical therapist in Webster, New York, and a certified strength and conditioning specialist. So tonight we're going to just kind of try to touch on some global risk factors just overall for injury in triathlon, and then we're going to discuss some of the specific mobility, stability, and strength needs that triathletes have, and then describe a little bit more about QT2's new functional assessment strength service that I have available. So if we look just kind of overall, kind of grossly at what causes overuse injury in sport, pretty much it's caused when the load we place on our tissues exceeds their ability to remodel. So obviously, if we put too much load on tissues, so if we're, running too much more than our bodies can handle, the tissue cannot remodel properly between bouts of activity. Ideally, we stress a tissue, it gets stronger as we recover, and then it can handle more load. But if we are loading it too frequently, too intensely, it will not be able to recover between these bouts. And conversely, on the other hand, if there's too little load, such as, well, we're injured, maybe you're non-weight bearing on one side, you lose strength, the tissues, the muscles, the tendons, they're not receiving enough of a stimulus to remodel and strengthen. So when we talk about load, it's just kind of it's influenced by many, many factors such as sport and non-sport. So usually we think of this as sort of our frequency, intensity, and duration of training, but life stressors, psychological stressors, rating of perceived exertion, they all play a role in our load. And then there's also a lot of different things that play into our ability to remodel and recover, like sleep, nutrition, that kind of thing. So if we look just, kind of looking at studies, different reviews that have looked at followed groups of runners in triathlons and triathletes and seen who gets injured, who doesn't, and tried to link different risk factors to injury. If we look at some of the risk factors that are intrinsic to the athlete, so these are things that are characteristics of the athlete, a lot of them can't change or they're pretty hard to change. So the most consistent risk factor for future injury is a previous history of injury. And that makes sense because a lot of times there's compensations, or tissues haven't healed correctly, or something else is weakened in the process of trying to unload and heal a different injury. Another intrinsic risk factor is hip abductor weakness. I'll get more into that. That's related to the muscles on the outside of the hip. Like length discrepancy has shown some kind of a little bit weaker of a relationship, but that has been linked to injury risk. A lot of times people think that pronation, so the foot turning in, they think that is kind of gets thrown under the bus as an injury risk factor. Foot type really hasn't been shown to be that much of a risk factor for injury. And then when it comes to characteristics such as age and sex, there's variable findings. There's not necessarily a consistent relationship, but this may be more dependent on injury type. So older males kind of tend to be more prone to things like calf injuries, hamstring injuries. Females maybe are a little bit more prone to things like stress fractures, hip injuries. If we look external to the athlete, so extrinsic risk factors, these are the things that are more of our training characteristics or things that are easier to modify. Usually this kind of extrinsic risk factors fall under the category just sort of as too much, too soon, or too fast. So our too much is our training volume. It's, our hours of training, our run mileage. Generally speaking, higher volumes are linked to increased injury risk. And that makes sense just because it's greater time of exposure. So you're running 40 miles a week versus 20, you're going to be running more. It's going to raise your injury risk a little bit. But it's not necessarily clear cut. There's not a consistent relationship. We all know those athletes who can run a ton, train a ton, never get injured, and those that, break down pretty more easily. Sudden increases are also linked to an increased injury risk. So that's our too soon. A lot of times you hear the 10% rule in terms of run mileage, to not increase run mileage more than 10% a week. That's not a hard and fast thing. It might be up to 30%, but that's one of those things that's a little harder to study because it's harder to, just kind of ethically take athletes and throw these huge increases in them when that's might raise their injury risk. And then finally, intensity. So that's our too fast, is our training speeds, that kind of intervals, that sort of thing. There seem to be just a similar risk with intensity increases as with volume increases. So it's not like raising intensity increases risk more than raising volume. They're both about the same. So just kind of want to try to be careful not to increase both at the same time too much. So what about, kind of getting all the way into run gait is a little bit beyond the scope of this, but if we talk about some factors with run gait itself, there was a study I found that looked at 72 injured runners and 36 healthy controls, and they had some pretty common injuries. So PFP is patellofemoral pain. That's pain on the front of the knee. It's one of the most common triathlon and running injuries. Medial tibial stress syndrome, that's our shin splints, another very common running injury. IT band syndrome, and then Achilles tendinopathy. So what they found were that the injured runners had greater contralateral pelvic drop and more forward lean in mid stance, and a more extended knee and dorsiflex ankle at initial contact. So in plain English, just kind of picking on my husband here, it's contralateral pelvic drop occurs when you're kind of in mid stance on one side and the opposite hip drops a little down to the side. There's various degrees of that can occur. He's actually kind of compensated a little bit by throwing his trunk over to the side of the stance leg, so it doesn't look quite as bad as it actually is, but that has been very commonly linked with injury. A lot of times what will happen is the knee will collapse in, it will put strain on the outside of the hip, the foot will have to try to compensate to try to stabilize more. And then our extended knee and dorsiflex ankle at initial contact, that's picking on myself, coming kind of when the foot comes in at this steep angle between the foot and the ground here, far in front of the body with the knee extended, that kind of increases impact force up the system and can increase some of the injury risk as well. But overall, they found that the pelvic drop was most strongly correlated. So we've got, just kind of these global overall risk factors and these like more epidemiological studies. So what can we do about it? So obviously we need to be careful with our load progression, but also we want to make sure our movement patterns for triathlon are optimized so that when we do load our tissues, they're moving in efficient ways that aren't going to increase injury risk. So if we kind of some things to consider is just, we think of our movements in triathlon, but triathlon training is just a small portion of our days, Otherwise, we're spent, maybe we spend 1 to 7 hours on our heaviest days training, but our postures and movement patterns during the rest of the day carry over to our sport-specific movement. So if sitting kind of the forward head and slouch back all day long at a computer, that will carry over to our triathlon movements. Then we also want to consider when we're developing strength, mobility, stability programs, we want to consider just the time and energy involved. Because obviously when we're spending a ton of time training, the little things are usually the first things that kind of get pushed to the back in order to swim, bike, run more. So we want to make sure we're kind of focusing on our specific needs versus just doing every exercise we know. And then, there's again with this concept of circus tricks versus useful exercises. It's like, you could be doing these fancy things like standing on one foot on a Bosu ball, juggling, but it's not necessarily the best bang for the buck. It might look cool, but it's not necessarily something that's functional for triathlon. So if we look at what we need to perform swim, bike, run. So kind of at the bottom of this pyramid here is mobility. We need enough mobility at our joints to move through the ranges of motion required to swim, bike, and run without compensating somewhere else on the line and stressing tissues that shouldn't be stressed. We also need enough stability to control the body while movement is occurring. And then at the top of the pyramid, we need strength and power to be able to propel the body forward. So starting with mobility, what's the most important? So bike and running are pretty much more mid-range activities. There's not necessarily a ton of flexibility that's needed, and more flexibility than what's required for the sport isn't necessarily beneficial. With that, You know, a lot of times when triathletes say something feels tight, it's not necessarily that the muscle is shortened, it's just that the connective tissue that surrounds the muscles might be bound up. And in which case, we might want to do more like foam rolling, percussion guns, that kind of things that just restore those tissues' ability to slide and glide past each other and just get more nervous system effects to make it to increase mobility. But at the same time, there are certain areas that are prone to actually having shortened tissues that are prone to actually having motion deficits in triathletes. So if we start with swimming. So some of the areas that might be mobility limited when it comes to swimming are kind of our upper neck muscles here, our upper traps and levator scap. This is sort of this upper crust syndrome posture that occurs a lot of times when people sit at desks, sit at desk jobs, sit at computers, or also on bikes for a while. Our upper back muscles, our neck muscles get tight, and then our pecs, our chest muscles get tight. And all of those things will limit our shoulder mobility, they'll limit our upper back mobility and our neck mobility when it comes to swimming, getting a good stroke. Thoracic spine extension too. So the spine in the upper back often gets curved forward. And when that gets curved forward, it again limits the ability just to raise the arm up. If we look in our lower body, we're going to need our hips to be able to extend, to be able to kick. And then ankle plantar flexion, we need to be able to point our toes all the way down, or else our feet are going to turn into just paddles behind us. On the bike. So on the bike, the main thing we're kind of concerned about flexibility wise is just hamstrings and posterior chain. So when we're in these forward flexed arrow positions, everything sort of throughout the whole back of the body ends up getting put on stretched. And if there's lack of mobility in the hamstrings, it can pull the pelvis out of alignment and create some issues throughout the lower back, especially. The other thing to consider with the bike is that the bike position can shorten muscles that will impact other disciplines. So when we're in this, again, forward arrow position, our hips get a little bit closed up, our hip flexors can tighten up. That's especially something that's common in triathletes that sit a lot. And when the hip flexors get tight, it sort of makes the low back, has been shown to be vulnerable during this bike to run transition, as a period where a lot of back injuries can occur because the hips are tight. And when the front of the hips gets tight, it pulls the pelvis out of alignment again. It will kind of excessively arch the back and can cause some issues there. And then again, kind of going back to that just upper crust syndrome slide, again, the bike position doesn't help anything there. It will, the front of our chest gets tight from being hunched forward all the time. And then run mobility keys. So and when I run, there's kind of two main areas I'll look at in terms of needing mobility. Our shin needs to be able to move forward over our foot in mid stance. So in mid stance here, the shin needs to be able to move over the foot really without the heel coming up off the ground. And that's mainly a function of the calf muscle flexibility, especially the lower calf muscle here, the soleus. If that gets too tight too, the heel will start to come up. And really what happens is normally our Achilles tendon actually acts like a really nice spring when we run. So when this shin comes forward, the Achilles will stretch, it will store energy that can be released to sort of push off, propel us forward. So if we don't have that, we lose some of that economy, we lose some of that efficiency. And then we'll also see some sort of deviations where the foot will pronate more, so the shin doesn't have to move as far forward over the foot, or the knee will dive in. So that's definitely something to look for there. And then the other main area of kind of mobility, flexibility that tends to be limited with running is our legs need to be able to get behind the body at kind of this terminal stance push off here. So our hip needs to be able to extend usually about like 20 degrees past vertical here to push off the body. This is a function again of our hip flexor mobility on the front of the hip, and also our great toe. This is kind of an area that tends to get overlooked, but that needs to be able to extend as well. And some of the compensations you'll see for that is that the low back will arch excessively in order to try to get the leg behind the body. So moving up a little bit, when we'll move towards that stability concept. So triathletes need to be stable against the high forces of sport. So what we need to be is stable throughout our trunk, throughout our shoulders, throughout our hips, in order to produce mobility and power throughout our limbs to move us through space. So one of the concepts we hear thrown around is this idea of kind of core strength, trunk stability. Some people don't like the term, some people, but it's our best terms we have for it. What we really mean by that is sort of our stability just around the trunk itself and then between the spinal segments to protect the back and neck. So if we look at kind of some of the areas or main muscles we'd be concerned about here. So our trunk, we've got this muscle, this transverse abdominis, that sort of wraps around the trunk and is sort of corset-like. And then our internal and external obliques are kind of similar, that they have the same ability to increase the pressure throughout our trunk. And they also will produce a little bit of side bending and rotation. But these muscles all, when they contract, they'll stabilize the trunk. They'll make it this nice, stable, increase the pressure throughout our abdomen so we're not flopping all over the place. And then kind of between spinal segments, one of the main muscles there of concern is this multifidus that runs between our spinal segments. And it helps to kind of protect them from excessive movement when we're moving our arms and legs. Another kind of key concept for stability and control is kind of going back to our cervical and our upper back postural strength. So our scapular stabilizers, these are our muscles that attach onto our shoulder blade and stabilize the shoulder blade. And that becomes really important in swimming, because if our shoulder blade isn't stable, it won't provide this nice base for our shoulder to be working from and can lead to a lot of shoulder problems. And then also another area of concern there is it's lower cervical extensors, upper cervical flexors. Basically, those are just the muscles that combat that kind of forward flexed head position that a lot of athletes have after sitting on computers and bikes all day. And then in terms of our shoulder stability, we're concerned about our rotator cuff. The shoulder itself it's a ball and socket joint, but the socket is pretty shallow. It doesn't have a lot of inherent stability to it. So it relies a lot on these more active stabilizers, including the rotator cuff, which helps to center and compress the ball of the shoulder into the socket. So pretty much what that means here, when we talk about our scapular stabilizers, there's a few that are kind of key. So we're mostly concerned about the muscles that sort of pull the shoulder blade down and back, or the ones that keep it from kind of stable against the rib cage to keep it from winging out to the side, because those are the ones that are going to keep it in a good position for the rest of the muscles to work from. Some of the main muscles there are just the lower part of the trap here, the lower trapezius. The serratus anterior helps kind of keep the shoulder blade centered on the rib cage. That's another big one. Rhomboids will pull the shoulder blade back as well. And then when we talk about our rotator cuff is made up of 4 muscles that sit on the shoulder blade. So again, we need those scapular stabilizers to keep this shoulder blade in a good position so the rotator cuff can work. And these 4 muscles all kind of work to help keep this, they rotate the shoulder in and out, they help raise it to the side, but they also help kind of depress and keep this head, the head of the humerus, the head of the shoulder bone here, centered in the socket. And if they're not working well, then it kind of creates this negative feedback loop where the ball will rise up in the socket and will pinch the tendons off and create a lot of pain and impingement with any sort of overhead movement, such as swimming, which can be very, very troublesome, as anyone who's ever had a rotator cuff problem could tell you. And moving down a little bit further, so that was all of our kind of trunk upper body stability concerns. Down further, we like to look stability wise at the strength on the outside of our hips, as well as how well it's timing. So kind of going back to that pelvic drop, we want to know if these muscles on the outside of the hip are strong enough and can fire at the right time in order to keep the pelvis stable here, or does the pelvis drop down, which is a deviation that we don't want to see. The main muscle here that we're concerned about is the glute medius. We're also concerned about the external rotators. So these are the muscles that turn the leg out, because the other deviation that you'll see is if they're not working well, the knee will sort of rotate in and collapse in that way and cause knee problems there. And then Finally, in the leg, this idea of this kind of foot core has been thrown around a little bit more lately, but pretty much we want some of these little muscles on our feet to be strong enough and stable enough to, what we want to see is that the first joint here should, where's my cursor? There we go. We want to see this get kind of, it should drive down when we go to push off to run. And what that does is it will actually elevate our arch and help maintain arch stability. There's also a couple muscles that come kind of from the shin down around the back of the foot that help maintain our arch as well, that become important in our foot stability. So finally, moving to the top of the pyramid here, if we're looking at what triathletes need strength-wise. So we need strength, obviously, to move through the water, which the water is 800 times more dense than air. The muscles that produce that power are largely our lats, our deltoids, our rotator cuff, our scapular muscles. We also need mostly lower body strength to produce bike power, obviously. That's large part our quads and our glutes. And then when we run, we need to be able to absorb a lot of force and then produce a lot of force, several times our body weight, pretty quickly. So, our foot's on the ground for under a quarter second usually. So we need to be able to absorb and produce force quickly in order to propel the body's center of mass forward against air resistance and against gravity while running. So calves are actually pretty overlooked as an important muscle in running. They're a major mover at all run speeds. And that we have our quads, our glutes, our hamstrings that all kick in as well. So some of the benefits of strength training, our running economy is improved. So this means that at any given heart rate, any given oxygen intake, we're able to run a little bit faster. The body is more economical. It improves tendon stiffness. So kind of when I was talking about the Achilles being a little bit of a spring, this will sort of improve that mechanism. That also plays into the running economy as well. Our more stiff tendons are able to store and release more energy. This can improve cycling's sprint performance, which might not be, our biggest concern if we're going to race an Ironman, but there's always somebody who doesn't want to let you get past and you have to pick up the pace there. This strength training can improve power and pace at VO2 max. So when we're at our kind of high intensity stuff, maximal output of oxygen consumption, that will make us be able to go faster or push out more power at that consumption. Strength training will improve bone mineral density. It's just near and dear to my heart these days. And the other thing just to note here is that there's not really any need to fear bulking up if you don't want to from strength training. There's not really evidence that supports that when you're concurrently strength and endurance training, you're gonna get any sort of major muscle hypertrophy from lifting heavy. So recommendations for triathletes are to load it up and to use higher weights and lower reps for strength gains. I think a lot of triathletes are just distance runners, long distance athletes tend to think more in terms of strength training for muscular endurance, but by and large, in order to recognize the benefits of strength training, so those improve muscle economy, the better tendon stiffness, that's going to be at our higher weights, lower reps. So, like sets of 6 to 8 at, 60 to 80% of 1 rep max. Some of the stability stuff, that would be the kind of thing you would want to do, just a lot of repetitions, muscle memory, that kind of thing. But in order to actually get true strength gains, we need to make sure we're loading enough. Plyometrics, so those are things like our box jumps, are things that incorporate any sort of stretch shortening cycle, like squatting, jumping up from that. Those are good for force development, especially with running when we have to produce force quickly. Force is more a matter of, your power is more a matter of our ability to generate strength quickly. Generally, I put kind of generally twice a week is what's good to maximize strength gains. You can do more than that, but I realistically, with most triathletes, and time constraints and training constraints and trying to fit in heavy strength around heavy workouts, a couple times a week is ideal. And we want to work our major muscle groups and big movements. So I'll show you examples of these in a second, but our big movements would be considered our squatting, our hinging, push, pull, carrying, and rotating. So squatting, any kind of squat, back squat, front squat, goblet squat, is like one of the just major muscle or major movements that is good to incorporate. Our hinge, so our hinging is anything that's sort of in the deadlift family. So single leg deadlift, hex bar deadlift, those kind of things. Pushing would be more of like our chest press, push-ups, those kind of things. And then pulling could be considered our pull-ups, lat pull-downs, anything in that family. And I also, depending on the source, will throw in things like carrying. So that would be, farmer's carry, where you're walking, carrying heavy kettlebells, and or rotational movements as well. So we've got all these mobility, stability, strength things that triathletes need. Well, how do we check out, how do we know what an individual athlete needs? So we kind of get into this idea of a functional assessment. Again, that's another one of the core strength. It's one of those buzzwords that gets thrown out a lot. And a lot of different people will have different definitions of it. There's like the functional movement system analysis that is more of a formal thing, but overall functional assessment is just looking at our posture. It's looking at how we move and then trying to determine how that's going to affect our sports specific movements. Takes a ground up approach, so looking just from feet, toes, and head all the way up to the head, and then looking in multiple planes of motion. So triathlons, our movements occur in the sagittal plane. We're moving forward in this plane here, but there's a lot of stability, there's a lot of different mobility that's needed in these other planes of movements in order to produce this sagittal plane movement most efficiently. So our QT2 functional strength assessment service, what that is, it's performed over Zoom and recorded for video analysis, so I can pull pictures, that kind of thing. Goes over the athlete's history, so what their goals are, what past current injuries and concerns there might be, background of athletics and triathlon, and then sort of daily physical stressors. Are you sitting all day? Are you on your feet all day? That kind of thing. Then we go through a movement analysis, looking at various mobility, stability, and strength tests from head to toe. They're demonstrated, and then I have you perform them from multiple angles, so head on from the side, just to see motions from both angles. And then the deliverables are a document that kind of pulls some screenshots, explains sort of the results from all these different tests and the areas needing work and why we're concerned about that. And then a mobility and strength program, which is updated after about a month. So some example tests that are on there. So one of the example tests is the single leg squat. So single leg squat, what are we looking for with it? So we want to see our trunk and pelvis stay level, and they shouldn't drop or lean excessively. So that goes back into that pelvic drop I was talking about earlier. We want to see our knee alignment maintained. So what that means is kind of when I was talking about that pelvic drop, when we see that sometimes, what we'll see is the knee will dive inside of the foot. So ideally we want to see the knee kind of stay in line with the hip and ankle, kind of over the second toe, but you will see variations in that. People just have different alignments to begin with. There's different structural alignments at the hip that can occur. So we want to make sure that what you have just structurally standing is maintained when you go to squat. I want to see the hips get back and then balance maintained. So why is this something we would look at? If we think about just running at its core, it's just a lot of repeated single leg squats. You land on your leg, you accept weight, you push back off. When you see breakdowns in this, and you see breakdowns in foot and hip control, it can cause areas in both the foot and the hip, and that will transfer the issues to the knees. The knees are just sort of in between the hip and knee and driven. It's by what happens there. And then, as I touched on before, weakness on the outside of the hip is seen with a variety of cycling and running injuries. So another test that we would look at is our side plank. And then adding in hip abduction, so adding in raising the leg up to the side. So what we want to see there is that the shoulders and the hips, the knees and the ankles should all stay aligned. This alignment should be maintained when the leg is raised, and the trunk and upper body don't rotate. So if I was going to nitpick on myself a little bit here, I am dropping just a hair when I go to raise the leg. So why is this important? Sort of as per the single leg squat, this looks at the strength on the outside of our hip, and that's needed to maintain pelvic alignment and prevent compensations and pain when running and cycling. And also another reason we look at plank positions is because they require stability throughout the shoulder blades. If you saw a lot of dropping kind of further up in the body, or if you saw from the rear view the shoulder blade popping out from the side, that might be a sign that there's lacking some stability in the shoulder blade there too. Another example test here is our bird dog. So raising one arm and the opposite leg well on all fours. So what we're looking for here is we want the head to stay neutral. So you don't want to see the head extend back or flex down. The spine should stay stable. The trunk should not twist excessively. The movement should be coming from the hips and the shoulders versus the lower back arching or rotating. And kind of this idea of if we were to place a book on the back, it would not fall off. So, I'm fairly decent here. I'm lacking a little bit of shoulder motion there, and the back kind of arches a little bit too much there. So why is this important? So if we think about running, it requires just this counter rotation of arms and legs around the trunk. So as one arm's going back, the other leg is coming forward. So we want the trunk and spine to be able to stay stable while the arms are kind of producing this counter rotation and not have excessive motion in order to prevent back issues. And this is also, rotational stability is also important in order to have power transferred to our pedals when cycling. So those are just this example of some of the things we might look at with our mobility and stability and strength. I'm just going to pull up here just an example of what a strength program deliverable might look like. Okay, so I use website. It's app called MedBridge that you can log into, and it will kind of show you, go through videos and instructions of different exercises. Sometimes I add other instructions in there too, but so example program. So if somebody came and we did an assessment, we found that they had a lot of tightness in their upper back, we might give them, or they're very hunched forward, we'd probably give them this extension over a foam roller for their upper back. So this is just okay, so that's just an example of how something I might give somebody that's kind of a fairly common area of mobility deficit in triathletes and what we might do to address that. Next, I pulled up here. This is a split squat. So this is an example of something I might give somebody if we saw a lot of issues with sort of their single leg stance or their squat where their knee was diving in. It's also something I give people a lot of times if they have some tightness on the front of the hip, because by bringing the hip back here, it brings the hip into a little bit more extension. Sort of, and then on a similar vein, something else I might give somebody who showed deficits in their balance or their foot control is this single leg running balance here. Again, so those last two are kind of, something I would focus if somebody had a lot of trouble with maintaining pelvic control while on one foot. And then just final kind of quick example of something in the program that I might give somebody. If somebody had a breakdown with that side plank, this is kind of a little bit lower level. So again, that's just something we might do for somebody that saw a lot of hip dropping with that side plank, that kind of thing. All right, so there's a whole bunch of references in case anyone cares. And then finally, any questions?
What is your take on like doing like yoga for injury prevention?
I am, anything that anyone wants to do in terms of yoga is very good. It gives a lot of different mobility, stability. It's not necessarily something that's completely targeted, but I think it's something that if someone wants to incorporate, I very much encourage it.
Yeah, all right. Because I have deal with the plantar fasciitis, like
yeah,
tons of goes, and it just came back and it was really bad, and I'm trying to get it to stay away from me because I don't like it, and I want to get away. And I was told the calves get tight, and that's what causes the plantar.
Yeah, definitely.
So I told to do yoga more than stretching. He said stretching is not really gonna, he said if you do yoga, I was told that's gonna be more beneficial. Like he said 4 days a week, 45 minutes. I went to an sports injury chiropractor guy.
Yeah. The good thing with yoga, with the plantar fasciitis too, if there's any weakness in the foot, it incorporates a lot of just single leg stuff too.
Yeah.
Help strengthen those little foot intrinsic muscles.
Would you recommend any strength training for plantar fasciitis, or any kind of person?
Yeah, it's hard to say because a lot of times plantar fasciitis, people fall into sort of the spectrum of the foot's really floppy and unstable, or the foot's super rigid and tight. So it's kind of depending on what the underlying foot type is.
Yeah. So I can, if I wanted to sign up online for this strength assessment thing, you can do that on the QT2 website.
Yep.
Oh, yeah. All right. Yeah. I mean, is there anything else you would recommend for someone who has just plantar fasciitis?
It's hard to say. There's evidence that stretching the heel cord helps in certain cases.
Okay.
All the typical, like rolling the foot on a ball. I think I do think that the strength aspect gets overlooked a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I've been doing the yoga, and rolling the ball, and
Yep.
I've been able to run again, so that's good.
That's good.
Yeah. Doesn't like to leave me alone. He goes away for months, and it's great, and then she goes back.
That's a very, very stubborn injury.
Yeah,
it's very hard one to deal with. Got from Russet. I find the further I get into the season, the tighter my adductors get. How do I avoid fix this? Have you been? I mean, typically, what I recommend for just muscle tightness is, if there's actually shortened tissue, is foam rolling and gun or percussion gun for a couple minutes, followed by stretching, is usually the best way to get at it, because usually the direct tissue work, the foam rolling, the gun will kind of loosen up any underlying adhesions. It will change just the nervous system tone to allow you to get more stretching motion out of it. And hitting things for a couple minutes on the foam roller before training can be really helpful too. I don't know if that answered the question. Anyone else?
This is Brian. Wondered just when we're incorporating like multiple workouts in a day, sometimes I find myself doing my strength training on the heels of my, my run or my swim and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
is that overload, or do I want to try and set up a gap, but then I feel like I need to warm up going into doing my strength training? So just trying to working into my routine that
Yeah.
extra strength time.
Yeah, there's a lot of different approaches that people will do with that. There's not necessarily any right or wrong answer. I kind of tend to lean towards just doing strength training on heavier days, but not when super fatigued. That way, so when you have a recovery day afterwards, it gives everything kind of globally a chance to recover. But it is hard to really go from like a super hard session to heavy strength. So, it's one of the things, there's not a great answer for it. But like you said, there's hours in between, it's good to just do a couple lighter sets, or maybe, walk around a little bit, just do something to get the blood flowing before hitting the strength training.
Yeah. No, I totally get that. I mean, you got to manage load. If it's an easy day, it's an easy day.
Yeah.
And, it's okay to do some mobility work on the heel end of,
Right,
your run,
right.
you do some strides, and then you're doing some, that higher repetition, lower load just to get that muscular endurance. And then on the days that's maybe a hard day after intervals, then you stack, a set of deadlifts, 3 by 6 by whatever. And then you're just really doing muscular strength.
Yeah, I think there was actually, if I recall correctly, there was one study where it looked at sort of the impact of resistance training before and after running. And I think they concluded that done after running, the running did not really impact maximal strength that much, but strength impacted running beforehand. So.
Oh, that if you did your strength training before you ran, your run depleted, but if you ran and then did your strength training, you were still able to complete the movement as efficiently on the strength training that the running didn't. That
was pretty much was the conclusion.
I think that's important. Like if I had to go to the gym or run and then go to the gym, do the endurance work first and then the strength second.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there is some, I'm not completely well versed on, I have to find it. I think there is some like super recent research. There's some new theories out there floating around about like doing resistance training and then waiting like 3 hours and then doing your long run, and how that can have certain benefits. But I think for the majority of people, it's just better to kind of do the endurance work first, then lift, and try to make it all more the efforts on the same day, and then be able to recover afterwards. But again, it's kind of life logistics too. So. All right. Anyone else? All right, well, that's all I have for tonight. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and let me know.
My only